I spent months, even years, trying to understand what Evangelion is and how it affected me in such a way that I felt very depressed. And I was trying so hard to try and get in touch with someone who was also deeply as touched as I am with Evangelion.
Today I'm going to talk about something I've never talked about before on my channel. So if this video feels out of place in the greater context of my video library, it's because it is. Instead of talking about an anime and divulging its hidden meaning or its influences, I'm going to talk about the real world. More specifically, I'm going to talk about how a particular fandom nearly pushed a vulnerable individual into suicide, and what you can do to prevent this in the future. A couple months ago, I was working on my Made in Abyss field guide when I received an email from an individual named Tom. The email asked if I was interested in reading his testimony regarding the bullying he endured at the hands of the Evangelion fandom. Intrigued, I invited him to share his testimony. To my surprise, his testimony proved to be darker than what I had anticipated, and as a result, I felt compelled to help Tom in every which way I could. After a back and forth conversation, we concluded that there needed to be more awareness about this problem ruminating from fandoms across the internet. Consequently, Tom suggested I tell his story from the perspective of a member of the very same fandom that tormented him, not because this was ever my story to tell, but specifically because I'm not Tom. This may seem confusing, so allow me to provide extra context. Tom, currently in his mid-20s, has Asperger's, and as a result of his condition, has seen the world from a unique point of view. Because of this reality, a lot of the events that I'm going to cover surrounding Tom's testimony are going to seem either outlandish or sensationalist, but I want everyone to keep in mind that Tom most likely does not think like you do, and as such, any depictions of Tom's behavior that seem different have to be understood using a little bit of humility. This is why Tom's story has to be told from the point of view of someone who does not think like him, because in doing so, we'll be able to put ourselves not in Tom's shoes, but in his bully's shoes, and in that way learn a thing or two about keeping our prejudices to ourselves, as well as knowing how to identify and reach out to a vulnerable individual. Our story begins in grade school. Tom, having been diagnosed with Asperger's at an early age during the early 2000s, which is a condition placed within the autism disorder spectrum, resulted in him attending special ed classes throughout his formative years. According to Tom, his experience was not one of support, but rather forced assimilation. In other words, teachers placed pressure on Tom to act neurotypical, as opposed to helping him navigate life with his condition. Naturally, Tom grew up unacclimated to the harsh realities of adolescence, finding himself bullied for his perceived differences. Not only was Tom bullied, but his grievances were habitually ignored by staff, perhaps wrongly assuming that Tom's Asperger's correlated with his credibility. Unsurprisingly, Tom's inadequate treatment during grade school caused him to develop rebellious tendencies throughout his upbringing. After realizing that the public school system was ill-equipped to handle Tom, his mother made an attempt to find a suitable school that would better cater to his specific needs. As a result, Tom was mistakenly sent to a boarding school that specialized in reforming students with behavioral problems. This misunderstanding resulted in Tom attending a school that mostly housed juvenile delinquents. This environment proved to be exceedingly hostile towards Tom, with both classmates and teachers habitually tormenting him for his neurodivergent behavior. By 10th grade, Tom had been gaslit by his bullies and school staff into believing that all his grievances were either imagined or overinflated due to his Asperger's. In fact, at one point, Tom was sexually assaulted in the showers, only to be told by teachers to deal with the problem himself. The extent of Tom's bullying didn't end there, however. Later that year, Tom received a death threat, had his guitar stolen from him, and even had his art teacher, who suffered from mood swings, manipulated into colluding with his own bullies. Tom eventually hit rock bottom when he lost one of his only two friends to bullies. You see, throughout this entire time, Tom had connected with another classmate who was also a victim of bullying. We'll call him Xavier. After time, Tom and Xavier became close, and as a result, prompted his bullies to joke that they were a gay couple, calling them lovers and whores. Eventually, after realizing that Xavier's relationship with Tom would only cause more torment than solace, Xavier began to resent Tom and eventually joined his bullies to avoid being bullied himself. This devastated Tom, as it left him isolated within the boarding school, with his only other friend Michael attending a different school hundreds of miles away. By the time Tom had returned home that year, His demeanor was so different that his mother finally realized the harm his school had done and resolved to send him to a therapeutic school. For the remaining 2 years of high school, Tom was finally given an opportunity to belong. Following his graduation, Tom experienced complete freedom and slowly began to rebuild his confidence. His journey to heal from his past traumas, however, ended abruptly when his only remaining friend, Michael, tragically took his own life following the separation of his parents. This unexpected event affected Tom so much that after experiencing sporadic breakdowns and an extended period of bereavement, Tom developed PTSD, being diagnosed shortly after. To make matters worse, immediately after his diagnosis, Tom later had to endure a several-month-long lockdown during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the time, Tom was in his 20s, living alone in a government-subsidized housing complex for people with minor disabilities, this being an environment that heavily enforced lockdown. Unable to interact with the outside world, let alone have access to in-person grief counseling, Tom began to lose his sanity in his solitary confinement and began to find ways to occupy his time and distract him from his deteriorating mental state. Tom began to consume media as a coping mechanism, both for loneliness and his PTSD. At one point, Tom decided to watch the film The End of Evangelion on a whim, without having first seen the original anime. Despite having watched countless films throughout his life, not to mention the many he had binged during lockdown, Tom had never experienced media-induced psychosis. That is, until he began to watch The End of Evangelion. Whether or not Tom's isolation leading up to his first viewing of The End of Evangelion contributed to his first psychotic episode is unknown even to himself. But the reality was that Tom began to experience a series of traumatic responses within the first few minutes of the film, with the infamous Shinji and Asuka hospital scene setting off a chain of increasingly visceral reactions to the film. It is possible that what Tom was experiencing initially were intrusive memories, since in his own words, he stated that watching the film was akin to reliving every single trauma from his entire life. But what came later during the film was what I could only informally describe as hyper-reality-induced psychosis. According to Tom, the depictions of the third impact caused such an acute reaction that he dissociated, and the lines between the film and his own life began to blur. According to Tom, the dialogues depicted in instrumentality were directed towards him, and he began to feel as if the characters were cross-examining him for his past actions, resurfacing old feelings of shame and guilt. In addition to feeling as if the film was interrogating him, Tom also felt as if he was witnessing a blasphemous religious ceremony, given that he lacked any context from the original series. In spite of experiencing one of the most horrific moments in his life, Tom was unable to look away and froze until the film ended, in which at that point he finally began to regain a grasp on reality. Well, kind of. You see, after speaking to Tom on a Google Meet, he further elaborated that this event in his life corresponded with an extended phase where he described himself as Evangelion obsessed. Over the following weeks, Tom began to research Evangelion extensively, believing that by learning more about it, he could somehow cure his own traumas. Tom's life was now intrinsically tied to Evangelion, and every single affliction he had before, from his bereavement-induced PTSD to his extended isolation under lockdown, were now amorphously fused with the Evangelion lore. For the next month, Tom felt as if he was dreaming about Evangelion, while also experiencing varying levels of lucidity in the real world. After several weeks of research, Tom, confounded by both the film and later the series, began to seek out counsel from the internet's most active anime communities. Tom began with Discord, first outlining his initial viewing experience, followed by questions pertaining to the philosophical arguments the series posed. Unsurprisingly though, Tom did not receive the good faith, engaging responses he anticipated, but rather received ridicule and apprehension in regards to his unusually strong emotional response, with his very first reply reading, "LMAO, imagine getting triggered from a 2D pixelated drawing. GTFO, you snowflake." Believing this particular Discord server was a dud, Tom continued to share his story on multiple servers, but much to his surprise, nobody took him seriously, with subsequent replies claiming that he had played up his story for attention. Perhaps at first, Tom didn't take much offense. After all, he had developed a thick skin in high school, but after realizing that not one person had been able to relate to his experience, he began to feel even more isolated than before. Isolation, however, was the least of his problems, as one of Tom's greatest insecurities began to resurface. To quote Tom's testimony, he stated, "The more they did so, the more I began to believe that I was faking it myself in ways that I couldn't even remember. In fact, I thought I was gaslighting myself. One of my greatest insecurities is misremembering certain things, as people have often blamed my Asperger's for their mistreatment of me, justifying themselves by using my mental illness as an excuse, both in 10th grade and within the fandom itself. When people downplay my experiences and say that nothing is real in regards to my thoughts and emotions, it makes me question my existence. I don't think they were fully aware of the extent of the damage they were causing me. In spite of the harm Discord was causing Tom, it also paradoxically served as his only lifeline. Tom put it this way: at the time, the only place I fully relied on for social interaction was Discord, both for obvious reasons, COVID, and for deeply personal reasons, social anxiety from bullying. This harsh reality meant that Tom needed Discord and in one way or another resolved to gain their acceptance. As a result, Tom continued to reach out. Over the next few months, Tom became increasingly addicted to Discord, frequenting as many Evangelion-related servers as he could. His unthrottled enthusiasm, however, made him stick out like a sore thumb to the vast majority of neurotypical users and subsequently became very well known. By no fault of his own, Tom admittedly could not identify why he was consistently singled out, and as a result, he began to organically get more and more candid regarding his relationship with the series. Though Tom was initially met with derision and disregard, he eventually managed to strike up engaging two-sided conversations. Due to a combination of Tom's Asperger's and unhealthy socialization from his formative years, Tom lacked the nuance to understand when he was either oversharing or exposing personality quirks that could turn him into a target for bullying. As a result, Tom ended up exposing many of his idiosyncrasies across multiple chats and began to be ridiculed for information that to him seemed innocuous. Though some of these admissions that were shared with me were certainly personal and unique, others did seem fairly inoffensive, and yet, even those admissions were weaponized. To illustrate just how malicious some of these Discord users were, Tom consented to me sharing a couple fairly innocuous admissions of his. The first admission was that at the time, Tom hated the character of Asuka because she reminded him of one of his tormentors from high school. I may not speak for everyone, but to feel angry towards a fictional character because they resemble a real person is pretty normal and common, and yet, Discord users use this as a pretext to bully Tom. One message read, "LOL, you're getting triggered by a fictional character? You probably have the hots for her. Get lost, you fucking pervert." Now, as standard as this response may seem, given that the internet has developed a reactionary culture, I'd like to add that this example is the most mild response to one of Tom's most mild admissions. The other examples Tom gave me resulted in not just mean comments, but targeted cyberbullying. In one of the several End of Evangelion discussions, a user prodded Tom into sharing how and why the film's opening scene evoked a traumatic response from him. Now, before I explain the aftermath of Tom's honest response to this question, I have to both elaborate my honest thoughts about the scene, but also point out the objective realities of what it's like to be a kid with moral qualms. For those who are watching this video and do not mind being spoiled about an insignificant plot detail from the end of Evangelion in order to understand the context of the aforementioned question, I'm going to provide a basic recap. The scene depicts two children in a hospital room, Asuka, a bedridden 14-year-old girl, and Shinji, a depressed 14-year-old boy. Shinji is shown visiting Asuka in the aftermath of her confrontation with a supernatural being called an angel. Asuka, having endured a mental infiltration by the angel, is shown to be unresponsive. Shinji, having just previously lost someone he considered a friend, frantically shakes Asuka in an attempt to wake her up from her comatose state, to no avail. Shinji, blinded by desperation, continues to shake Asuka until he accidentally rolls her over and exposes her breasts. The camera then cuts away to a shot of the hospital room door showing that it had been locked, before the camera switches to Shinji's hand, now covered in semen. The scene ends with Shinji lamenting his action, quietly whispering, "I am the lowest of the low." This scene's relatability transcends its content matter and instead depicts a nebulous representation of instances of moral weakness and the regret that follows. Prior to this scene, Shinji had been forced to kill someone who he believed loved him, and in the throes of his subsequent trauma response, attempted to resuscitate a comatose person by shaking them violently, an action that indicated Shinji's vulnerable state. After exposing Asuka's breasts, Shinji succumbs to his animalistic instincts, knowing that his actions are beyond reprehensible. Shinji's vulnerable state greatly compromises his moral discernment and as a result, reduces his inhibitions to the point that he consciously pleasures himself to a non-consenting person. This scene was never meant to excuse Shinji's actions, and by all means was meant to represent Shinji in a negative light. Having said that, This scene represents something very real, and was absolutely necessary to represent a teen's lapse of moral judgment in the face of trauma and instant gratification. I, for one, immediately related to the scene and drew parallels from instances in my life when I knew I was doing something terrible and yet continued to do it because I was too morally corrupt to stop. That is, until I had already done the deed. Images of my younger self stealing from my mother's purse to buy an airsoft gun flooded my mind by the time the scene ended. Shinji's admission that he was the lowest of the low triggered a feeling of shame in me for an action that to this day I never confessed to. So now back to Tom's experience. Tom's honest answer to an inquiry regarding the trigger that induced his psychotic episode then must be viewed with empathy, as the entire point of the hospital scene was to arouse feelings of shame and reflection. Not thinking much of the question, Tom confided that the scene elicited a suppressed memory of a sexual encounter he had in his childhood, something which caused him so much shame given his religious background that he later confessed to his mother and asked to be punished as a form of atonement. Now, before I describe the backlash of this honest admission, I'd like to point out a few things. For starters, Tom's experience wasn't shameful at all. In fact, I learned that what he described was delineated by the American Academy of Pediatrics to be considered healthy behavior for children of his age at the time. Secondly, I'd like to share that Tom and I deliberated on whether or not to even allude to this event in question. As reluctant as I was to do so, we decided that it would only do Tom's testimony a disservice by omitting this event for the following reasons. The first reason is that this confession became the catalyst for a relentless cyberbullying campaign at the hands of Discord users, and by omitting any references to the event, there would be no context to contrast the level of dishonesty and malice his bullies propagated. The second reason is that after hearing about his experience, I immediately recognized that there was literally nothing to be ashamed of. Despite the internet being composed of mostly sensationalists and immature netizens, I felt that by openly treating certain topics with the maturity they required, I could combat the internet's infantile reactionary nature toward serious topics by example. Thirdly, I felt that by keeping Tom's true identity under wraps, as well as not going into detail about this personal event in his life, Tom would be spared from further bullying, while at the same time being able to pass on an anonymous version of his testimony to the greater public. Having said all that, it's no surprise that Discord chose to weaponize Tom's admission, given the fact that by this point, Tom was already being bullied by the community for the erroneous belief he was fabricating Evangelion's impact on his life for attention, as well as for analyzing the series on a near scholarly level. This confession became the server's most dangerous piece of ammunition against him. Immediately, rumors began to proliferate and spill out into adjacent servers, with Tom's DMs erupting with death threats and personal attacks. At first, the rumors claimed Tom was a pedophile and a sexual deviant, but within days, multiple servers began to circulate personal details about Tom that he hadn't shared on the original server. Whenever Tom would attempt to clear his name, members would bring up the death of his old friend Michael, claiming that he was murdered by Tom in an attempt to keep him from talking about being sexually assaulted. As outlandish and perhaps tongue-in-cheek as these claims were, what alarmed Tom the most was the fact that after a prolonged and openly public internet presence, details of his life were beginning to be pieced together by what seemed like a coalition of Discord users. Within a week, Tom was consistently being doxxed and publicly accused of grooming by users claiming to be minors. In order to further protect Tom's identity, I will not show the screenshots that were provided in his testimony, even with redacted usernames and profile pictures, as specific conversations can still be found by the perpetrators. But I will summarize the three main types of harassment I saw. The majority of the messages he received were death threats, as well as general insults in the vein of, "You're so disgraceful, I'd rather eat shit than to have to see your username on the server," and stuff like that. The second type of messages I saw were people offering to speak with Tom as a form of solidarity via FaceTime, only to be ridiculed by entire private servers for believing they were being genuine. The level of cruelty I saw in the messages that mocked Tom's gullibility were particularly gut-wrenching, considering that his Asperger's made it nearly impossible to discern people's intentions. Despite that, I found that the most vile messages he received were of users repeatedly trying to entrap him by sparking up friendly conversations, briefly mentioning a juvenile age, and then sending sexually suggestive messages, causing Tom to immediately block them. Now, due to the number of messages he received like this, I can only assume that they were organized by entire servers. Having been reliant on Discord for social interaction, Tom stubbornly stayed on the platform, hoping things would get better. You see, even after the pandemic ended, Tom had conditioned himself to only seek social interaction from the internet, and as a result, found that his social anxiety prevented him from leaving. For 2 subsequent years, Tom's internet presence was plagued by death threats and derision, until one day he finally gave up and believed that he would never be able to feel liked or loved for who he was. That very same day, Tom walked across a bridge that he had crossed many times before and looked down, contemplating suicide. According to him, had it not been for his fear of hell, Tom surely would have jumped, but he didn't. And after coming so close to ending his life, he began to break down and shakily made his way home. It was at this point that Tom turned himself in to a mental institution and subsequently distanced himself from everything that once gave him respite from the many traumas of his past. Here, Tom deleted Discord, Reddit, and distanced himself from all things Evangelion, simply so that he would no longer remind himself of the torment he endured. After an evaluation, in addition to the PTSD he was diagnosed with years prior, Tom learned that he also had depression, anxiety, and that he was experiencing psychosis. Relieved that his experiences were valid this entire time, Tom finally felt free to find happiness elsewhere. Today, Tom plays his guitar, writes poetry, has an employment he enjoys, and attends regular therapy sessions. It's likely he will carry the scars of his past for the rest of his life, but at least now, he has a future to look forward to. And to quote Tom directly, "Since I left the fandom, my life has changed. Since then, there is never a dull moment." What happened to Tom isn't an isolated event. There are millions of people struggling with mental health every day, and many other millions with Asperger's, autism, dyspraxia, and many more types of neurodivergencies. You don't have to understand these conditions to be compassionate, and in fact, you probably never will. So the next time you see someone on the internet acting a bit different, there's a good chance they're not trying to be quirky or sensationalist or misleading. Consider that they might just be different, and if it's not your cup of tea, just leave them alone. Another thing, the moment you see someone getting picked on online, report it. There's a small chance it's banter, but don't take that chance. And after you've done that, reach out and ask the victim if they're okay, and then let them know they're worthy of love. Because for all you know, they don't know. P.S. If you're someone who is struggling with mental health issues or need a professional to talk to, I've provided links for 2 international hotline directories in the description below. Don't hesitate. We love you and hope to see you better. P.P.S. To all Evangelion fans out there, just a reminder, you're not Hideaki Anno. You didn't work at Gainax, and you're not working at Hara. I understand it's fun to speculate on certain meanings and events in the series. Hell, I do that on my channel all the time. But if at any point you insult or gaslight anyone you disagree with about the series, you're not only an insecure asshole, but a complete waste of space. Getting worked up about a cartoon to the point you attack someone for having a different opinion or experience is not only fucking embarrassing, but it's a great way to show the world you're too much of a wimp to control your own emotions. So yeah, be the bigger person, or at least pretend to be, and let it go. Thanks for listening. I love y'all dearly. Ciao.